today? All right, good, all right. All right and good. Is that a good all right or just an all right? I'm just kidding. Hey, glad to be with you this morning. I'm Tim, if you don't know me, and I don't know you, and I'm the lead minister here at Markle Church of Christ, and I get to continue on where Jason started us last week as we are taking a dive into the book of Ezra. And really, Ezra and Nehemiah, those two books kind of form one book, one work, and they're meant to flow out of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And the number one thing I know about these books is there tends to be long lists of names. Anybody ever just done a devotional on just genealogies before? I heard that there's a new plan in the Bible app for just that. I'm just kidding. Well, anyway, we're not going to jump into lists of names and genealogies today. We're going to look at Ezra chapter 3, the first 7 verses today. And last week we introed into Ezra, and Jason brought about this idea of the importance of rhythm in life, and the fact that the people, the exiles that were in exile under Babylonian rule, have been allowed to return to the land that they called home and begin to reestablish practices of worship. And really what they're missing is the rhythms of worship, the rhythms of their devotion, their faith in life. And as we know that in many different aspects, having rhythm in life is an important thing. It is much more so important when it comes to matters of faith. And so we're going to take that idea and run further with it this morning in chapter 3. But I wanted to start off by getting an idea in our head and then kind of crushing it afterward. Okay, has anybody ever had what you would call a mountaintop experience before? You know what I mean by that? Mountaintop experience, typically the mountaintop experience, really, if you want to get literal, is being on top of a mountain and looking out and in awe of God's creation and just, a sense of like you've not only conquered something by getting up to the peak of that spot, but just the feelings, the emotions, all that come with that. You can't really come down. It's the peak of experience. And so we use this idea of the mountaintop experience in many different facets to mean anytime you have a peak experience in life. And I've often heard of the idea of the mountaintop experience being something that people have when it comes to their faith. They might have a high water mark point where they feel like their faith is on fire, like it can't ever be squelched. I'll tell you about one of mine. One of my mountaintop experiences occurred when I was in college. I had to take geology. And if you were in geology class at CCU, may she rest in peace. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. When you were in geology class at CCU, you had to take a field trip. You didn't have to. You could get out of it. And believe me, I tried. I didn't. Okay, look. You have to understand. I was dating a girl whom I'm now married to and have been for a while. And we didn't go to the same college. So the idea of spending a weekend in the wilderness away from my lady, I really didn't want to be there. Which is what makes it a nice mountaintop experience, as I'll describe. So I'm at this field trip, and the whole idea is we're going to go on some trails, and it's going to culminate in Mammoth Cave, and we're going to camp out. And I remember the first night of it, it was kind of strange. So I'm a music person too, and I very rarely told anybody I was a musician in school because I wasn't in the music program, and I always thought there were so many other people better than me, and I just didn't want to tell people about it or whatever. But the nice thing about not telling people is that you could participate in worship music moments and not like have to, do something like bring your own craft. You could just sing with the rest of the crowd or whatever. By the way, if you like doing that sort of thing, you should come tonight to the worship night. I didn't even realize I was going to throw that plug in there, but since we're talking about it, be here at 6 o'clock tonight. It'll be great. I'll be here too. So anyway, but back on the story. So we are, the stars are out. It's dark. We're all around a campfire. And some folks that were in the geology class that were also in the music ministry got their guitars out, and we had a night of worship. And it was really, really, really wonderful. And it broke the ice for me. I went from thinking about all the reasons I didn't want to be on this trip to just losing myself in it. And so that night really kind of roped me into the entire experience. We weren't just there to learn about the science, but we were there to experience God's creation. And where that culminated for me was in Mammoth Cave. We went down into the cave and saw the stalagmites and stalactites, and I don't remember which ones are up and down, but if you know, you know. And we're going through all of them, and we finally get to this spot that where there was like a slope kind of rock, and we were all told to kind of sit down. And they had lighting in this cave area so you could go through it. But part of the plan was to get us all seated and shut off the lights. And it's pitch black. And that day, we were talking about the first chapter of the Gospel of John, where we learn that Jesus is the light to come into the world, and we learn many other things about Jesus in that chapter. And we were focusing on this idea that he is the light in darkness. And here we are in this cave, pitch black. I can remember they even told us, go ahead and put your hand in front of your face, which normally when someone tells you to do that, you don't want to do because they're ready to hit it in your face. But they couldn't see where your hand was to do that, so I was like, okay, this works. I put my hand in front of my face, and it's so dark I can't even see it. And then someone takes out a lighter. They were supposed to. And they flick the one light on, and this small little flame illuminates the whole thing. And it really brought that idea that Jesus is the light in the darkness to life, and no pun intended, to light. And I remember leaving that trip and thinking how wonderful it was. How I was someone that didn't want to be there, that had better things to do, better time to be spent, walking away as the days, the weeks, the months, and even at times the years went by, wishing I could go back to that place. Because literally when that light went on, my faith was like a flame lit. That was a mountaintop experience for me. Something clicked for me then. Something inside of me about my faith in Jesus and my calling just clicked. I stopped being so understated about worship leading, and I got more involved at my church after that. And it really wanted me to learn and to capture those teaching experiences and share them with other people at that moment. So I ask again, have any of you had a mountaintop experience in your faith before? You can raise your hand. I told you mine. Feel free later on, you can tell me yours or whatever if you want to or whatever. So before I go any further, when I said I was going to ruin things, let me qualify that. Mountaintop experiences are great. They're incredibly formative. Jesus constantly gave people mountaintop experiences. In the deep dive session last week, I got to talk about one of Peter's mountaintop experiences. He was on a boat with Jesus that he didn't want to be on. In fact, he told Jesus, I've been out all night fishing, and that's the last thing I want to do, but since you're asking and I trust you, let's go out there. And all of a sudden, after catching no fish the night before, Jesus orchestrates a miracle catch of fish so large that they can't even haul it all into the boat. And Peter is just awestruck at being around Jesus. He in fact says, "Go away from me, Lord, because I'm a sinful man." Basically, I don't have any business being around you. You're too good for me. And Jesus says, no. From now on, you'll be fishing for people. There's a mountaintop experience. Or how about when Jesus calls Levi, or when he calls Nathaniel, or he tells Zacchaeus to get down from that tree? You think those weren't mountaintop experiences? Trust me, they were. Mountaintop experiences are wonderful. But the thing, though, is we can get so attached to them that we can start to diminish the small, the daily, the mundane acts of faith that we're called to live out, that we're called to carry out, that we're called to be obedient to, that we're called to give our lives to, that end up growing us into a more robust faith. And so it raises this question, well, if we get so stuck on wanting to get back to the mountaintop experience, the question that comes to mind is, well, if the small stuff is supposed to matter so much, what makes it matter? Now, this week I was on I saw a blog post on the internet. There was 10 things to say in a meeting to make you sound smarter. And apparently, one of those 10 things, number 6, is in the middle of the meeting, out of nowhere, for random reasons, ask the question, yeah, but will it scale? It'll instantly make you sound smarter in the meeting, right? But the thing, though, is when we are people that want to get back to the mountaintop, we oftentimes kind of ask the question about the small stuff. Will it scale? Will it measure up? Will it get me back where I want to go? Or will it create a new experience up at the top of the mountain that I can look forward to ascending to? Will it scale? And to give you an example, and since Jason talked about rhythm and the importance of rhythm in music, I'll use another music example. This question, will it scale? I have a belief, not proven. You might disagree with me. But I have a belief that the best songs that have ever been written can be scaled down to the most bare bones elements. Maybe a guitar and a voice, or a piano and a voice. And yeah, all the other instruments and all the cool solo parts and all of the vocal runs that people do in a song, they all sound wonderful. And you can listen to a song and find a moment in a song that just is breathtaking. It is so complex and so talent-filled. But from a pure standpoint of a song, if you can't scale it back to its smallest element and it still stand on its own 2 legs, it just might not be that good. So, when it comes to songs, if you play a song at its most basic elements, the proof of whether or not it scales is whether or not it is sound in its most bare bones state. And typically, if something is that good, it will scale. When you add all of the frills and all of the instrumentation to it, it still stands the test of time. And that idea of going from the mountaintop to coming back down to the bare bones, the bare minimum, and asking whether or not it scales or not, leads us perfectly into Ezra chapter 3. Because Ezra, again, is about the people of God that have been in exile coming back and trying to reestablish worship, reestablish rhythm, reestablish devotion to God in the way that it was meant to be. But the problem, though, is that when they came back, they didn't come back to a glorious temple and everything that they had still in place. It had been destroyed, gone, kaput. They had nothing. And so what do? What do? Now, if you are a person that wants to go back to the mountaintop experience, you might think to yourself, well, the first place to start is, we got to get this temple rebuilt. And that'll eventually happen. If you know your history, there was the first temple that the Babylonians destroyed. And then eventually there came the second temple, and it's a couple of different iterations. There was the second temple that begins in Ezra and Nehemiah. And then, of course, Herod the Great, or Herod the Terrible, really, comes along. He was still a good builder and made it that much more leading into the time of Jesus. And that's the second temple that we know that Jesus and his disciples and all the Jewish people that they were a part of went to or pilgrimaged to. But in Ezra, we experience the people that have come back looking and wondering, how do we start when there's nothing to start with? What do we do? And that brings us to the first 7 verses of Ezra chapter 3. And I want you to follow along with me on the screens or in your Bibles as we read this. It says, when the seventh month arrived and the Israelites were living in their towns, the people assembled in Jerusalem. Then Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, and his priestly colleagues, and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and his colleagues, started to build the altar of the God of Israel, so they could offer burnt offerings on it as required by the law of Moses, the man of God. They established the altar on its foundations, even though they were in terror of the local peoples. And they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord, both the morning and the evening offerings. They observed the festival of temporary shelters as required and offered the proper number of daily burnt offerings according to the requirement for each day. Afterward, they offered the continual burnt offerings and those for the new moons and those for all the holy assemblies of the Lord and all those that were being voluntarily offered to the Lord. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord. However, the Lord's temple was not at that time established. So they provided money for the masons and carpenters, and food, beverages, and olive oil for the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar timber from Lebanon to the seaport at Joppa, in accord with the edict of King Cyrus of Persia. Now, this is one of those passages, if you're reading through this book, and there are many in these books, that you might blow by, specifically the ones, like I said before, that have a bunch of names. And you can think to yourself, well, okay, they don't have a temple yet, and they're planning to rebuild it, and they're participating in this festival, and they are doing these burnt offerings. And anytime I hear about burnt offerings, my head wants to explode because I can't remember the number of pigeons and how it's supposed to go, because I probably skipped over that part in Leviticus and Numbers. No, I'm kidding. So what do I make of this? Well, I want to point out a few things here to help us understand this passage. Number one, the fact that they are coming back at the tail end of the 7th month means that they're in a season in which they are meant to commemorate this festival that is required of them. You might know it as the Festival of Tabernacles or the Festival of Booths. The translation that I just read here, I picked because of this festival. The translation here reads, the Festival of Temporary Shelters. And I like that translation. It's not as reminiscent and doesn't quite roll off the tongue as booths, or maybe even if you like saying tabernacles. But it gets to the heart of what's going on here. You see, this festival was meant to remind the people of their time in the wilderness. And when you're in the wilderness, you don't have a stationary home with a roof over your head. You have to build temporary shelters or booths, or tabernacles, if you want to call them that. But see, booth has this connotation of like a booth. I've been recently watching Charlie Brown stuff with my son. You know, Lucy's always setting up the booth to make money off some really fraudulent psychiatry. We think of booths that way, you know, and there's an exchange and stuff. That's not what's happening here. The booth, it's better to think of it as a shelter. And so what the people had to do is they had to go out and they had to get branches from special sorts of trees, and they had to bring them to this occasion. And they actually had to set up temporary shelters, roofs over their heads, and live there for 7 days so that they could be reminded of what it was like for their ancestors to live in the wilderness. Which is a really interesting thing to do if you think about it. Because pre-exile, doing this would have been kind of weird. You already have a permanent house, a permanent place to live, a permanent place to worship, and so you just go do this because this is part of your tradition. But imagine doing this festival coming after exile where you have nothing established. You already know what it's like to be in the wilderness because, figuratively speaking, and somewhat literally, you are in the wilderness. You have no home. You have no set structure of worship. You have no protective measures around you. What do you do? I love, and I believe it's here, verse 3, where it says that they established the altar on its foundations even though they were in terror of the local peoples. If you're there to worship and you have no building, you have no structure around you, you have no walls to mark off your community, you are exposed. You are vulnerable to attack. What do you do? And so if you are an exiled people and you are wondering what to do, it would be completely understandable to come and say, we're not doing anything until we get some walls built. It doesn't feel right. I don't see the walls I'm accustomed to. I don't see the temple and the worship layout that I'm used to. I don't really like the open air. I don't like the feeling that these locals, these cultists around, could come in and attack, could come in and mingle, get us off course. And isn't that what we just came out of exile from? Getting off course because the peoples around, we adopted their ways instead of the Lord's ways, and we ended up attacked and taken from our land. You think we want that again? No. I long for the mountaintop experience of temple worship. And yet in this passage, the Lord's temple was not at that time established. And yet the people came together. They participated in this festival of temporary shelters. They put up their temporary shelters. They constructed an altar on the spot where it should have been, even though the spot where it should have been didn't exist. And they started to practice the burnt offerings that the law of Moses and their scriptures commanded them to do. The morning and the evening offerings every day. The people knew that in exile they were out of rhythm. And they needed their rhythm back. And so they come and they start. But they don't start by trying to reestablish the mountaintop experience. But they start with the small, the daily, the foundational, even before the foundations are laid. And so it begs the question, will it scale? Will what they're doing, will what they're trying to establish, Will it scale up? Will it scale up to the pinnacle of that old-time temple and their old way of life that they so long to get back to? Will it scale? The other thing about the temple is when the small stuff isn't there, what you have is a magnificent building that's hollow inside. Have you all read the story of when Jesus is crucified? Hopefully you have. If you read it in the Gospel of Matthew, there's this interesting little detail at the moment that Jesus dies. Do you know what detail I'm talking about? The veil of the temple is torn. It's an interesting thing. There's kind of two takes on that. One of them is that it's an outer veil that gets torn, which means the passage symbolizes that worship of God is now out in the open because of Jesus and no longer relegated to the magnificent structure of the temple. But others wonder if it's the veil of the Holy of Holies. I'm not really sure which one I land on, but I had a professor of mine once point out that when the people are taken into captivity, that God effectively leaves the temple. You know, we don't have a story about him coming back in the second one. See, when Jesus showed up, he called people to live the kingdom life, to do as he said, to do as he did. And not just in the grandiose worship kind of ways, but in the small ways. For instance, he said that you are his follower and you are doing it for him if you even give a cold cup of water to a little one that's in need of a drink. It's as if you are giving it to him. That's a small act of faith. If you give your child bread instead of a stone, if you don't repay a strike on your cheek with a strike to your enemies. Jesus constantly and perpetually exhibited and taught small-scale acts of faith and obedience. And he said he's the only way. And so it's interesting that in that moment in the Gospel of Matthew, that when he exhibits the most faithful act of all time in laying down his life, opening up the way to God, that the veil of the temple is torn and it exposes its hollowness. Small acts of faith scale up, but a mountaintop experience without the small daily grind of faithfulness and obedience is rendered hollow. I'll tell you a time that I learned this. See, because I'm as human as you are, and I can succumb to the desire for the mountaintop experience. Quite a few years ago, I really struggled to develop devotional habits. I probably haven't told you all this. Maybe some of you have. I didn't grow up in church. So if you ever talk to me about like children's songs that we all remember back in the day, I will give you a blank stare because I don't remember them. I didn't grow up hearing them. I got brought to church and I got brought to faith by friends in my teenage years. And since then, my family, who did go to church before I was in the picture, they all one by one started following suit with me. But because I didn't have that tethered and that rooted faith experience from the get-go, I had to learn important yet small, simple steps of faith on the go. And they're very, very hard to add in when you're not accustomed to doing them. So believe it or not, despite the fact that I'm a Bible nerd, I wasn't very consistent at reading the Bible on a regular basis. So much so, in fact, that I oftentimes longed to have somewhat of a mountaintop experience when it came to reading the Bible. I needed the setting to be perfect, the time to be perfect, my attention to be perfect, all of it. Any of you relate to this? Any ever sit down and feel like the time, the place, my mentality is just not right? And I'll go ahead and I'll shut it and I'll come back to it when things are good. And so because of this, I never got into, to use Jason's word from last week, a rhythm. Because the small step of reading a little bit at a time, a little bit at a day, didn't measure up to my desire for that mountaintop experience. You know, it's hard to crack this thing open when the table's a mess. It's a lot easier when you're in the cave and someone does the light trick and it really illuminates the passage. You know what I mean? But not every moment's like that. So one day, Angie and I were at dinner with some friends, and we got into this discussion. And a friend of mine, the couple that was there, she said, you know, I used to have that mentality too. She's like, but I realized something. If I start reading it in small bits on a daily basis, there will be days where I will come to it, and I will read the chapter, and I won't remember anything that I just read. Because all of the worries of the day that have already come, or the worries that are ahead, were clouding my mind, and I couldn't focus. But I did it anyway. And yeah, I felt like I was checking off a box. But the next day I came to check the box again. And even though I was just doing it going in to check the box, I ended up suddenly getting pulled in. You ever had that kind of reading experience? My buddy Nick over here, he and I were talking recently. I think we're both reading through the Lord of the Rings right now. And I just did that because I'm, it's pleasure reading at night, okay? But I realize it's a really, really long thing, and so I need to read a little bit every day if I ever want to get through it. And so I do that, and sometimes I pick it up and I'm like, I'm not sure if I'm going to begin. And the next thing I know, I've blown through 20 pages and I'm like, oh my gosh, I remember how awesome this story is. I do that with the Bible sometimes. You sit down, you think, I'm just going to get a few verses in, but suddenly you're locked in and you just go. Sometimes you come and the mountaintop experience is there, and yet it gets ruined for this reason or that. So anyway, the point my friend had was this. Rather than only waiting for the mountaintop experience, the perfect environment, the perfect time, the perfect mental space to come to it, just come daily. Because guess what happens when you do that? You'll come back around again next year to that passage that you couldn't remember when you finished reading, but when you come back to it next time, it'll be the one that grabs you. And the one that you were grabbed by the previous time, you'll probably check out at some point. Notwithstanding the fact that the genealogy lists will always bore you, but you should still read through them because they're actually interesting. Here's the point. Small acts of faith scale up. It doesn't always work the other way. Because if the small, the mundane, the daily acts of obedience and faith and giving yourself to the things that God calls you into to help you grow in faith, if you dismiss those, if you discount them, if you forego them, when you do come across that occasional mountaintop experience, it'll be either rendered hollow or you'll spend the next couple of years after it wishing you could go back, rather than embracing what you have daily right in front of you. But when you stick to the small stuff, the amount of personal growth and the growth of those around you that you are spurring on to love and good deeds is beyond measure. I just was talking to friends Tyler and Katie this morning, and mentioned the fact that we often can discount the effort we put into just one person, but we have no idea how far that can go. We have no idea how far one prayer, one chapter, one conversation, one chance meeting, 1 hour can go. But God can work it into immeasurability. Small faith scales up. And that's what we get from this chapter in Ezra 3. Small faith scales up. And that leads us into a time of communion this morning. Hopefully, when you came in, you grabbed one of these. You know, it's funny. Although in the immediate aftermath, I'm not sure that the disciples would qualify the Passover meal as a mountaintop experience, considering what came right after. But you know, it probably felt like it was going to be a mountaintop experience. We come together and we take this bread and this juice each week, and it seems so small and so insignificant, barely enough to eat and drink. And we know that when this was originally done, it was done in the context of a full meal and a conversation amongst friends and teaching from the rabbi. A mountaintop experience. And yet it's so easy to discount something like this that provides us rhythm, that provides us with an opportunity at obedience, because Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And furthermore, while taking these elements each week is a small token of faith and measure, it calls to our memory the largest act of faith ever, that Jesus laid down his life so that we could have life and have it to the full. And so I invite you to take and eat of this bread, because this is his body, which is given for us. And in the same way, I invite you to take and drink from this cup. This is his blood, which is poured out for us. Please pray with me. Dear Lord, I thank you for being able to be here in a place that for many of us is routine. It's easy to come and go and think that it's insignificant. Maybe some of us think it's not enough. Maybe it isn't. But it matters that we come here together, that we sing your praises together, that we hear from your word together, that we sit shoulder to shoulder together, that we take communion together, that we participate in worship together. Just makes us yet again those in a long line of the people that were called to you to come together and worship. And though each element and each week and iteration of this service might seem insignificant to us, it does not lack significance. And all the other things that we might write off as small and insignificant can lead to immeasurable faith. And so God, my prayer this morning for me and for everybody in this room and those that aren't with us that are at home today, I pray, God, that you will help us to take the example of the people in the book of Ezra that came together without their mountaintop experience, their mountaintop space in place, and did what you called them to do. And let that be the foundation. And I pray, God, that you will help us to do the same in both our individual journeys of faith and our collective ones. That we will come together and that we will do our part to participate in the rhythms that not only grow our faith, but that allow us to live it out in each moment of our lives. And God, I pray that a moment like this when we take communion will be an example of just how significant something so small is. Let us not pass it up or overlook it, but let us cling to it and let it give us life so that we can go on living faithfully and obedient for you and to leading others to do the same. And we pray these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.